Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the election of 1920. Oh, it was a strange one. Once again, nothing of the likes of the 1912 election, in which you had practically war taking place. But the election of 1920 was unique in many different ways. First off, you had the war, which had just ended. You had the Treaty of Versailles, which had ended. You had the League of Nations that was basically up in the air because no one knew what was going to happen. You had a president that was incapacitated, who really was not too aware of everything that was going on. You had a vice president who was not totally concerned about becoming president. In fact, he did everything in his power to avoid becoming president. And you had a bunch of people that were trying to become president. You had a whole bevy of individuals that had the interest, but many of them would never go very far. One of the things that's most unique about the presidential election of 1920 is that Woodrow Wilson, which he had become incapacitated with a stroke. I mean, he was bedridden, and he had his moments when he was with it. Many other times he did not. And what was quite shocking is he let it be known that he would be willing to serve a third term. And nobody wanted that. And when he heard that no one was interested, he lost control, and a string of obscenities came screaming out of him. He was a sick man. He was a sick man when he became president. He was not the healthiest of individuals. You know, information only within the last few years has been released about Woodrow Wilson, and it's quite frightening that he was having a whole series of what we might call mini strokes, and that he was acting most unique and most bizarre in Versailles. I mean, he was having his room redone with furniture every few days because he was paranoid. Well, he had created his 14 points, and that is the reason that Germany accepted an armistice on the 14 points. The only problem was every other country wasn't going to follow the 14 points. And Wilson had become his own Secretary of State to a degree. Wilson was the first president to go over to Europe, and he negotiated the treaty for the United States. Now, here's where it gets crazy. He never thought of having a bipartisan group to perhaps work out the deal, which would make life a lot easier. No, it was his way or no way. He was a very stubborn man. And as he got sicker, he became more stubborn. Now, his son-in-law was William McAdoo, and he had great interest in becoming president. And he was waiting for an endorsement from his father-in-law. There never was one. McAdoo made recordings trying to sound like he was presidential, but never went anywhere. Eventually, in 1920, the cast was set. Now, if you had looked at this in 1918 and discussed who was going to run, the feeling was that by 1918, everybody was ready for Theodore Roosevelt again. He had behaved himself. He had learned his lesson. And everyone said he would be the perfect person to be president and also to run for president in 1920. He would only be in 1920 going on 62 years of age, which was not that old at all. And many people were saying that his vice president, good chance it might be Warren G. Harding. Warren G. Harding probably could have run for president in 1916, but there was a lot of controversy going on behind him. He was being threatened by a mistress, and that's another story altogether. On the Democratic side, it eventually worked its way out to James Cox. His vice president was an individual who you, of course, will know. His name was Franklin D. Roosevelt. What is even more interesting in this bizarre 1920 election is that you had Warren G. Harding was nominated as the Republican frontrunner. His vice president would be Calvin Coolidge, who became very famous for his work during the police strike in Boston. I'm going to be playing recordings of a good deal of this group, and probably the most unique recording of all will be a recording of the sister of Theodore Roosevelt. Now, who do you think she would be endorsing? One would guess that perhaps a distant cousin, Franklin D. Roosevelt. No. She was behind Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. It's very interesting. There were two sections of the Roosevelt family. There were the Theodores and the Franklins. They did not get along well at all. And going as far as 1932, when Franklin D. Roosevelt was running on the Democratic ticket as president against Hoover, Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt was basically campaigning for Herbert Hoover. Pretty amazing when you think about it. So we're going to listen to a number of recordings of individuals leading up into the election of 1920. We're going to hear from Harding. We'll hear from Cox. We'll hear from McAdoo. And we will also hear from Theodore Roosevelt's sister. Kind of an interesting thing. And through it all, in the middle of this vortex going around where everyone's trying to figure out what's going to happen, was an individual steaming and angry named Woodrow Wilson, who really wanted a third term. Amazing.